Story 1. I was visiting a family friend when I noticed a rolled-up carpet in the corner of the room. It looked suspiciously lumpy, almost as if something heavy was hidden inside. My curiosity was piqued, and when I asked about it, the friend casually mentioned they were recently out of a long-term relationship that had ended badly. Not wanting to pry further, I let it go. A few days later, this person suddenly announced they'd bought a one-way ticket to Southeast Asia and would be leaving the country. I never heard from them again. Looking back, I sometimes wonder if there was something sinister hiding in that rug. Story 2. My mother-in-law once stepped in dog poop outside our apartment. Instead of cleaning it off outside, she came into our kitchen, grabbed a butter knife, and scraped the mess off right into our sink. The sight was revolting, and to this day I still feel uneasy about anyone handling my utensils. Story 3. I once visited a friend's house where I noticed an old, musty stain on the carpet in their living room. When I asked them about it, they said it was from their dog, who had passed away years ago. They'd just never bothered to clean it up. The thought of sitting there made my skin crawl, and I couldn't bring myself to eat dinner in that house. Story 4. My mom worked for a cable company and would often hear wild stories from the installers. On one occasion, a technician walked into a house and immediately noticed the stench of decay. As he walked further, he discovered a dead body in the living room. Instead of calling the police immediately, the homeowner had simply covered the body with a sheet and continued with their day as if nothing was wrong. It's terrifying to think someone could be so nonchalant about such a discovery. Story 5. When I went to a friend's house for a board game night, I was taken aback when I found dirty underwear draped over the chair I was supposed to sit on. None of the other guests seemed to find it odd, and I was left awkwardly trying to move the garment out of the way. That was the last time I attended any event at their house. Story 6. I once helped clear out a hoarder's house. The amount of clutter was overwhelming, but what shocked me the most were the piles of trash, rotting food, and an infestation of cockroaches. It was heartbreaking to see the homeowner living in such conditions, but they seemed completely unfazed by it all. Story 7. A former co-worker lived with her boyfriend in a small, cluttered apartment. One day, I noticed she had a bro code sign hanging by the door, listing all the things her boyfriend allowed in their home. Each rule was demeaning, especially the ones targeted at women. Needless to say, I didn't stay long. Story 8. I once rented an apartment in a high-rise where an elderly man lived. He'd been in the same unit since the building opened in the 60s. His mattress was nearly black from years of use, and he had no sheets, just a stained pillow and a blanket that looked decades old. It was disturbing, to say the least, to witness the state of the place he called home. Story 9. During a house tour, I noticed a full room adorned with plaques and memorabilia of a very dark history. These were awards, not for military service, but for loyalty to a racist organization. It was unsettling, and I excused myself as quickly as I could. That was the last time I visited that place. Story 10. I once met someone who had an entire room filled with hundreds of collectible dolls, each one displayed eerily with dead, glassy eyes staring into the room. The walls were covered with porcelain faces, making me feel like I was being watched from every angle. I didn't spend long in that house. Story 11. I once went to a neighbor's house to borrow something and noticed there were absolutely no bed sheets on their bed, just a bare mattress. It was yellowed and stained. When I asked about it, they casually mentioned they didn't see the point in using sheets since they'd just get dirty again. I politely declined the invitation to sit down. Story 12. While working as a real estate photographer, I visited a house owned by a state trooper. It was in a nice neighborhood, but there were obvious signs of rage. Holes punched in walls, splintered doors, and padlocks ripped off in frustration. I felt a deep sense of unease for the family living there, surrounded by so much pent-up anger. Story 13. One time, a friend invited me over, and I noticed her cat casually walking across the kitchen counters, right where she prepared food. She didn't seem bothered by it, but I couldn't help but think about the litter and germs being spread. I avoided eating anything prepared on those counters. Story 14. I visited a colleague's apartment once, and the entire place was eerily empty, almost like a display home. There were no personal items, decorations, or even signs of daily life. It felt cold and unnatural, like nobody actually lived there. Story 15. A family I knew never cleaned their aquarium. The water was murky, and the fish looked sickly, swimming sluggishly in the filth. It was disturbing to see the lack of care they had for these animals, which were essentially trapped in a small, toxic box. Story 16. I stayed at a friend's house during college, and when I went to take a shower, I noticed the shower curtain was coated in black mold. They had lived there for a year, and no one had bothered to clean it. I took the fastest shower of my life and avoided touching anything. Story 17. I went to someone's house for a party once and found that they had a collection of memorabilia from a rather infamous historical period. There were flags and books that left no question about the ideology behind them. I made an excuse and left quickly. Story 18. During a D&D session at a new friend's house, I was horrified to find dirty baby diapers piled up in a corner of the living room. The smell was unbearable, and when I asked if they needed help cleaning up, they just shrugged and said it was normal. I made an excuse to leave early and never returned. Story 19. One time, I stayed over at a friend's house and found out that they only had one towel for everything: drying hands, cleaning spills, and wiping down surfaces. It was damp and smelled terrible. I used paper towels for the rest of my stay and made a mental note to bring my own towels in the future. Story 20. I once dated a guy who lived with his grandparents. Their house was infested with roaches and the smell was overpowering. They would scatter every time you turned on a light. I realized the smell had stuck to his clothes and hair, and I eventually had to break it off because I couldn't handle the lingering stench. Story 21. While visiting my sister-in-law's house, I noticed their cat would pee and poop in random spots around the living room. When I asked why they didn't have a litter box, she explained that she thought the cat would just go outside. Unfortunately, the cat didn't always make it, and it seemed like nobody cleaned up the mess. Story 22. I knew someone who had a kitchen cloth that was used for everything: drying hands, wiping down counters, and cleaning spills. It was always damp and smelled like mildew. I brought it up once and they laughed, saying it builds character. Story 23. My dad did home inspections for insurance, and he once visited a house that was falling apart. The floors were rotting, nails were sticking out everywhere, and there were aggressive dogs chained in the yard. The children inside were filthy and barely clothed. It was so heartbreaking that he reported them to child services immediately. Story 24. I once met someone with a massive political flag covering their entire living room wall. It was such an intense display of their beliefs that it made me uncomfortable, and I didn't stick around long. Story 25. My best friend's family had a ritual where they'd pass around a bottle of anti-fart drops at the dinner table, and each person would add some to their food. It wasn't exactly a red flag, but I couldn't shake the weird feeling it gave me. Story 26. A friend from high school invited me to dinner once, and their entire kitchen was coated in grease and dust. The stove was caked with food residue, and there were pots in the sink that looked like they'd been there for days. I politely declined the meal and left early. Story 27. When I was little, I went to a friend's house where they had a huge family dog that wasn't house-trained. They allowed it to relieve itself anywhere in the house, and the smell of urine and feces was unbearable. I made sure my parents never arranged another playdate there. Story 28. I was visiting a relative and noticed their pet's water bowl was crusted over with grime. The water was murky, and the bowl hadn't been washed in what looked like months. I cleaned it myself and filled it with fresh water, but it was clear that basic pet care wasn't a priority in that house. Story 29. A friend invited me to their home, which had black garbage bags for curtains and only a box spring with a dirty blanket as a bed. They said they were just getting settled, but it had clearly been like that for months. Story 30. I went to a house where the only decoration was liquor bottles lined up along the shelves. They had no furniture apart from a few mismatched chairs, and there was an old mattress on the floor. It felt less like a home and more like a setup for something questionable. Story 31. I once stayed overnight at a friend's place, only to wake up and find her entire family passing around a bottle of Beano at breakfast. Apparently, it was their ritual to prep for the day by taking anti-gas drops. I couldn't help but feel awkward watching them. Story 32. I visited an acquaintance's home once and noticed that they had a collection of young women's ID cards. When I asked about it, they gave a vague answer, claiming it was a hobby. I left quickly and never looked back. Story 33. One time I went to pick up a friend for an outing, and as I waited in their living room, I saw they had several holes punched into the walls. It was unsettling, especially when I noticed that some of the holes were patched but others were fresh. Story 34. I knew a family that never let their dogs outside. As a result, the dogs relieved themselves all over the house, and there were stains and smells everywhere. I couldn't imagine how they could live in such conditions, and I didn't stay long. Story 35. A guy I used to know had an entire room dedicated to swords and axes. The walls were covered with medieval weapons, and he seemed way too enthusiastic about them. It was a bit too intense for my liking. Story 36. I once helped a friend move and found that she had several boxes labeled Mom's Hoard. They were filled with random junk, and she admitted that her mother refused to throw anything away, so she was now storing it all. I felt bad for her, but I also understood why she didn't invite people over. Story 37. I met someone who had jars of preserved snakes and insects as decorations. Their living room looked like a taxidermy museum, and I couldn't relax, surrounded by glass jars of dead creatures. Story 38. I was at a friend's house, and when I asked to use the bathroom, I was horrified to see their dish rack covered in black mold. They would put clean dishes on it to dry, completely unfazed by the mold. Story 39. My ex-wife never let the dogs outside when I wasn't home, so they'd relieve themselves indoors. Coming home to a house that reeked of dog urine was a nightmare. When we divorced, I swore off owning dogs for a long time. Story 40. I dated someone whose house was infested with bed bugs and lice. They seemed completely unfazed by it, but I couldn't handle the constant itching. I broke it off when I found a bed bug in my car after a visit. Story 41. My friend's mom was a hoarder. I helped him clean their house once, and we found piles of expired food, mountains of clothes, and an infestation of mice in the basement. It was eye-opening and heartbreaking. Story 42. I was once invited to a party at a house with Confederate and Nazi flags proudly displayed in the living room. I left as soon as I saw them and made sure to avoid those people in the future. Story 43. I stayed over at a friend's house, and in the morning I noticed a dead cockroach on the kitchen counter. They just brushed it aside and made breakfast. I couldn't bring myself to eat there and left early. Story 44. My mother-in-law once mopped the kitchen floor, then used the same mop to clean the dining table. I was horrified, but she didn't seem to understand why that was a problem. Now, I always offer to help with the cleaning when I visit. Story 45. I visited a home where they let their cats roam freely on the counters, tables, and even the stove. I had to politely decline when they offered me food. Story 46. A friend once showed me their collection of animal bones. They said it was a hobby, but seeing skulls and bones arranged on shelves in their living room was unsettling. Story 47. I went to a house where they used old towels as curtains. The entire place looked like it hadn't been cleaned in years, and there was a strange odor throughout. Story 48. My ex had a house filled with dead plants. Every single plant was dried up and brown, and they seemed unfazed. It felt like a reflection of the lack of care in other parts of their life. Story 49. I was once at a friend's place and found out that they didn't keep any cleaning supplies. There was dust everywhere, and the bathroom looked like it hadn't been cleaned in ages. Story 50. A friend's home had black bags taped over all the windows. When I asked why, they just shrugged and said they preferred it that way. It felt eerie, and I didn't stay long.